The glass doors of Ethelgard Global swung open with a heavy, expensive thud, revealing a lobby that looked more like a modern art museum than an investment firm. The air inside was chilled to a precise 68 degrees, smelling faintly of sandalwood and extreme wealth. Arthur Penhaligon, his 62-year-old frame slightly hunched, pushed his industrial-sized mop bucket across the pristine white marble. The wheels of the bucket squeaked just a little too loudly for a place this quiet, a sound that felt like a crime against the surrounding luxury. Arthur was dressed in his usual uniform, faded gray coveralls that had been washed so many times the fabric was starting to fray at the cuffs. His hands, calloused and mapped with deep lines of age, gripped the handle of the mop with a steady, practiced rhythm. He didn't look like a man who belonged in a skyscraper. He looked like a ghost from an era of manual labor that the world above him had long since forgotten. The silence of the executive wing was suddenly shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Italian leather soles. Kenji Sato, the 35-year-old CEO who had become the face of the company's new aggressive expansion, marched down the hallway. He was flanked by 3 high-level investors, all of them wearing suits that cost more than a janitor's annual salary. Kenji was mid-sentence, gesturing wildly with a hand that sported a $50,000 watch, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who believed the world was his personal playground. He was laughing at something one of the investors said, his eyes scanning his surroundings not for people, but for imperfections. Arthur noticed the group and moved his bucket to the side, pressing himself against the mahogany-paneled wall to stay out of their path. He had just finished mopping a small section of the floor, and the marble was still glistening with a thin, damp sheen. "Watch your step, sir," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The floor is still a bit slick right there." Kenji didn't even look at him. He was too busy explaining a new high-frequency trading algorithm. He stepped right onto the damp patch, his heel sliding perhaps half an inch. It was barely a stumble, certainly not a fall, but to Kenji, it was an unforgivable public embarrassment. He stopped dead in his tracks. The investors stopped behind him, their faces mirroring his sudden, sharp irritation. Kenji looked down at his shoes, then slowly turned his head to look at Arthur. His eyes were cold, narrow slits of pure condescension. "What did you just say to me?" Kenji asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet hiss that felt like a snake coiling in the room. Arthur stood his ground, his gaze calm. "I was just warning you about the floor, Mr. Sato. I wouldn't want anyone to get hurt." Kenji let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that held no humor. He stepped closer to Arthur, invading his personal space until the smell of his expensive, citrusy cologne drowned out the scent of the floor cleaner. "You wouldn't want me to get hurt? Look at you. You're a relic. You're a stain on the image of this firm. I'm hosting the most important people in this city, and I have to walk past a man who looks like he crawled out of a gutter." He gestured vaguely at Arthur's overalls with a flick of his wrist. "This is Ethelgard Global, not a basement. You are paid to be invisible, not to speak." "I'm sorry you feel that way, sir," Arthur replied softly, his voice showing no sign of the anger that would have consumed a lesser man. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job?" Kenji sneered, his face reddening as he felt the eyes of the investors on him. He felt the need to reassert his dominance, to show them how he handled inefficiency. Without warning, Kenji raised his foot and delivered a sharp, deliberate kick to the side of the mop bucket. The plastic cracked under the force, and the bucket tipped over. Gallons of gray, dirty water surged across the floor, soaking into the thick, hand-woven Persian rug and splashing directly over Arthur's worn leather boots. The investors gasped, but Kenji just stood there, his chest heaving slightly. "There, now you actually have something to do. Since you love this mop so much, why don't you get down on your knees and make sure this rug is dry before I get back from my meeting? And don't use the mop. Use your hands." He leaned in closer, his voice a cruel whisper. "People like you are just human debris, Arthur. You're the trash we step over to get to the top. Remember that." Kenji turned on his heel and walked away, his entourage following in a stunned, awkward silence. Arthur stood alone in the middle of the flooded hallway, the dirty water soaking through his socks. He didn't yell. He didn't move. He simply looked down at the mess, his face an unreadable mask of stoic dignity. He knew something Kenji didn't. He knew that every empire eventually crumbled, and usually, it started with a single crack in the foundation. The cold, damp sensation of the dirty water soaking into Arthur's socks faded away, replaced by the ghost of a much older memory. The pristine marble of the Manhattan lobby dissolved into the oily, cracked concrete of a drafty garage in Queens. It was 1994, and the air smelled of gasoline, cheap coffee, and the metallic tang of ambition. A younger Arthur, his face smudged with grease but his eyes bright with hope, sat huddled over a makeshift desk made of plywood and cinder blocks. Beside him, Martha was wrapped in a thick wool cardigan, her fingers flying across the keys of a second-hand computer as she balanced the books for their fledgling company, Ethelgard. They didn't have millions back then. They had exactly $42 in their joint savings account and a vision of a company built on the radical idea that every worker deserved a stake in the success they created. The struggle was a physical weight. Arthur remembered the bone-deep fatigue of working 16-hour shifts, first as a daytime mechanic, then spending his nights as a commercial janitor for a downtown law firm just to keep the lights on in the garage. He remembered the sting of his eyes in the fluorescent light, the way his back screamed every time he bent over a mop, and the quiet shame of counting out nickels and dimes at the grocery store while people in suits rolled their eyes behind him in line. But he did it for Martha. He did it because they had a dream. He remembered the night they finally landed their first big contract. They had celebrated with a single shared cupcake and a promise that no matter how big Ethelgard grew, they would never forget the feeling of the dirt under their fingernails. But the past held darker shadows too. Arthur closed his eyes, and the memory shifted to a rainy afternoon 15 years later. He was standing in a sleek, modern office, looking down at a young, trembling intern named Kenji Sato. Back then, Kenji didn't wear $5,000 suits. He wore a cheap, oversized blazer from a thrift store and shoes with soles so thin he had lined them with cardboard. Kenji had been caught sleeping in the break room because he couldn't afford rent. Arthur hadn't fired him. Instead, he had walked into the room, placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder, and told him that hunger was the best teacher, but no one should have to learn on an empty stomach. Arthur had personally signed the check for Kenji's business school scholarship, seeing a spark of drive that reminded Arthur of his own youth. He had mentored Kenji, taught him the intricacies of the market, and eventually handed him the keys to the kingdom, believing that a man who had started with nothing would surely protect those who still had nothing. The memory soured as Arthur recalled the gradual transformation. He watched in his mind's eye as the gratitude in Kenji's expression slowly curdled into a cold, diamond-hard arrogance. As the zeros in Kenji's bank account grew, his memory of the thrift store blazer seemed to vanish. He began to equate wealth with worth and poverty with failure. Arthur had watched from the shadows of his semi-retirement as his protégé became the very type of man they had once mocked, a man who mistook a title for a soul. The vision snapped back to the present. Arthur was back in the lobby, staring at the puddle of gray water Kenji had created. The stoic silence Arthur maintained wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the silence of a scientist observing a failed experiment. He reached into the hidden pocket of his frayed overalls and felt the cool, hard surface of a burner phone. He thought of Martha, who had passed away before seeing what their dream had turned into. He thought of the young Kenji he had tried to save, and the monster that had taken his place. The pain of the betrayal was a sharp, localized ache in his chest, but it was overshadowed by a cold, clear sense of purpose. Arthur reached down, not to scrub the floor as he had been ordered, but to pick up a small, high-tech device he had planted under the edge of the reception desk earlier that morning. He checked the data encryption light. It was blinking green. Kenji thought he was mocking a man who was beneath him, never realizing that the trash he was stepping on had spent the last 6 months documenting every offshore transfer and every backroom deal Kenji had made to fuel his gambling addiction. Arthur pulled out the phone and typed a single, chillingly calm message to his legal lead, Marcus. "The audit begins tonight," he wrote. As he hit send, Arthur looked up at the golden Ethelgard logo on the wall. He had built this house, and if the foundation had become rotten, he was the only one with the right to tear it down and start over. He wasn't just a janitor cleaning up dirt. he was a founder preparing to purge a virus. The tension at Ethelgard Global didn't just simmer, it boiled over into a toxic new reality. By Monday morning, Kenji Sato had implemented what he called the Professional Image Directive, a policy that felt like a slap in the face to every blue-collar worker in the building. From now on, all custodial, maintenance, and kitchen staff were strictly forbidden from using the main elevators or crossing the marble lobby during business hours. They were relegated to the service basement, forced to navigate the building like rats in the walls, entering through a rusted steel door near the loading docks. Arthur stood in that basement, the air thick with the smell of exhaust and damp concrete, watching his co-workers bow their heads in silent humiliation. Among them was Sarah, a 24-year-old receptionist with a tired smile and a heart far too large for the corporate machine. Sarah was a single mother who often arrived early just to catch her breath before the phones started ringing. That morning, she found Arthur leaning against his mop in the dim light of the service corridor. Without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out a thermos of hot coffee and a plastic-wrapped blueberry muffin. "You look like you had a rough night, Arthur," she whispered, offering him the cup. "Don't let him get to you. Some people have more money than sense." Arthur took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest. "You're a good soul, Sarah," he said, his voice soft with genuine appreciation. "But you should be careful. Kindness is a rare currency in this building lately." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the heavy service door swung open with a violent clang. Kenji Sato stepped into the dingy hallway, looking like a man who had accidentally wandered into a sewer. He was accompanied by Mr. Henderson, a senior board member with silver hair and a permanent sneer, who clutched a leather briefcase as if he feared the very air in the basement might stain it. Kenji's eyes locked onto the scene, the receptionist sharing a moment of humanity with the janitor he had humiliated just days prior. "Unbelievable," Kenji muttered, his voice dripping with disgust. He marched toward them, his expensive shoes clicking sharply on the uneven concrete. "Is this what I pay you for, Sarah? To host tea parties for the help? I thought I made it clear that there is a hierarchy in this company for a reason." Sarah jumped, nearly dropping her bag. "Mr. Sato, it's my break time. I just thought Arthur might like some." "I don't care what you thought," Kenji barked, stepping so close that Sarah had to retreat against the cold brick wall. He turned to Henderson with a theatrical roll of his eyes. "You see this, Bill? This is the rot I was talking about. You let one of them think they're equal to us, and suddenly the whole system breaks down. It's a lack of discipline." Henderson nodded, his voice thin and condescending. "It's a shame, really. Some people just don't know their place. Perhaps the girl would be more comfortable working at a diner where this kind of commonality is encouraged." Kenji looked back at Sarah, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "You're right, Bill. Sarah, you're fired. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out, and don't bother asking for a reference. I don't give recommendations to people who fraternize with the trash. Please, Mr. Sato," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling. "I have a daughter. I can't lose this job. I've worked so hard." Arthur stepped forward, his eyes flashing with a cold fire that should have warned Kenji, but the younger man was too blinded by his own ego to see it. "Mr. Sato, she was just being a human being. There's no need to take her livelihood away over a cup of coffee." Kenji spun around, his finger inches from Arthur's face. "You speak when I tell you to speak, janitor. You're lucky I haven't had you arrested for trespassing yet. You're nothing. You're a ghost in a gray suit, and if you say one more word, I will make sure you never find work as much as a dog walker in this city again." Kenji snapped his fingers, and two large security guards appeared from the stairwell. They grabbed Sarah by the arms, ignoring her quiet sobs as they dragged her toward the exit. Kenji watched them go, looking as satisfied as a hunter who had just bagged a trophy. Arthur stood motionless, watching Sarah's silhouette disappear into the pouring rain outside the loading dock. He felt the cold wind whistling through the door, chilling the basement, but the ice in his heart was much colder. He looked at Kenji, who was busy laughing at a joke Henderson had made about cleaning up the office. Arthur realized then that the time for observation was over. The lesson had to be taught, and it had to be absolute. The heavy steel door of the loading dock slammed shut, locking with a finality that echoed through the empty service corridor. Arthur stood in the shadows, his gray coveralls damp from the spray of the rain and his shoulder still aching from the rough shove the security guards had given him on Kenji's orders. He was officially fired. To the world, he was just another elderly man losing his grip on the bottom rung of the ladder, discarded like the very trash he had spent months collecting. He watched through the reinforced glass as Sarah sat on the curb across the street, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the weight of a future that had just been stolen from her. The sight should have broken him, but instead, it acted as a catalyst, hardening his resolve into something unbreakable. He reached into his locker, the only space in this multi-billion-dollar tower that he had truly owned, and pulled out a small, battered leather satchel. Inside wasn't a lunchbox or a spare uniform. He pulled out a sleek, black encrypted tablet and a pair of high-end noise-canceling earbuds. As he sat on the wooden bench in the locker room, the sounds of the bustling city outside faded away, replaced by the crisp, digital audio of a recorded conversation from 3 nights ago. He adjusted the volume, listening to Kenji Sato's voice, stripped of its public charisma, sounding frantic and desperate. Kenji was talking to a known high-stakes bookmaker, pleading for more time to pay off a $12 million debt, promising that he would have the funds shuffled from the Ethelgard offshore accounts by the end of the week. A slow, grim smile touched Arthur's lips. This was the leverage he had been waiting for. For months, he had played the victim, allowing Kenji to scream at him, to kick his bucket, and to treat him like a ghost. He had let the villain believe he was winning so that the villain would stop looking over his shoulder. Kenji thought he had just removed a nuisance. In reality, he had just released his predator from his cage. Arthur didn't feel like a victim anymore. He felt like an architect. He tapped a few commands on the screen, authorizing a secret, shadow audit, through a third-party forensic firm he owned under a different parent company. He walked out of the service entrance, moving with a sudden, purposeful stride that didn't match the hunched silhouette he had maintained for months. He crossed the street through the downpour, stopping beside Sarah. He didn't say a word at first. He just held his umbrella over her, shielding her from the cold New York rain. She looked up, her eyes red and puffy, her face a mask of defeat. "I'm sorry, Arthur," she whispered. "I'm so sorry you lost your job because of me. I just wanted to be nice." Arthur looked at her, and for the first time, he let the mask slip. His eyes weren't those of a tired janitor. They were sharp, commanding, and filled with an ancient authority. "Don't be sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "The rain is necessary for the ground to clear. You didn't lose anything today. You just moved to a better position." He reached into his pocket and handed her a small, embossed business card with nothing but a phone number and a name. Marcus Thorne, Senior Legal Counsel. "Call this number tomorrow at 10. Tell him Arthur sent you. You're not going to be a receptionist anymore." Sarah stared at the card, confused, but something in Arthur's tone stopped her from questioning him. He turned away, disappearing into the mist of the city, his mind already 3 steps ahead. He wasn't going to just fire Kenji. He was going to dismantle the man's entire existence in front of the people he spent his life trying to impress. The long game was over. The trap was set. Arthur Penhaligon was no longer cleaning floors. He was preparing to sweep the board. The following week at Ethelgard Global was a study in profound contrasts, a silent war being waged beneath the surface of glittering corporate success. Kenji Sato was riding the high of his own perceived brilliance, his ego swelling to match the panoramic views from his penthouse office. He spent his afternoons giving interviews to sleek financial magazines, leaning back in his leather chair with a smirk that screamed untouchable. He laughed off the minor, technical glitches, with his corporate platinum card as he treated his friends to $5,000 bottles of champagne at a rooftop lounge in Chelsea. "You have to prune the garden if you want the roses to grow," he told a journalist, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying lack of empathy. He even made a joke about the old janitor he had finally swept out, calling it his most satisfying executive decision of the quarter. The room erupted in laughter, a chorus of privileged men celebrating the crushing of a spirit they never even bothered to understand. But while Kenji was basking in the artificial light of his own fame, Arthur Penhaligon was moving through a world of ironclad focus and quiet intensity. He had traded his gray coveralls for the silence of a high-security war room in a nondescript building across town. The air here didn't smell like floor wax. It smelled like ozone and old paper. Arthur sat at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by a team of elite forensic accountants and silver-haired lawyers who spoke in the hushed, reverent tones reserved for a king. There were no cameras here, no press, and certainly no ego. There was only the grind, the meticulous, soul-crushing work of connecting the dots Kenji thought he had erased. Arthur watched the monitors as his team pulled up the encrypted logs he had retrieved while cleaning Kenji's office. Every keystroke, every panicked late-night transfer to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and every deleted email to high-stakes bookmakers began to assemble into a digital noose. Arthur didn't feel joy as the evidence mounted. He felt a weary, profound sadness. He watched a video feed of Sarah, the receptionist, walking into Marcus Thorne's law office. She looked confused and small, but as Marcus explained that her mortgage had been paid in full by an anonymous donor and that a trust fund had been established for her daughter, her face crumpled into tears of pure, disbelieving relief. Arthur turned away from the screen, his heart aching. This was why he did it. Not for the money. He had more than he could ever spend, but for the people the Kenji Satos of the world thought were disposable. The preparation was silent and absolute. Arthur spent hours reviewing the guest list for the upcoming Legacy Gala, the massive event Kenji was throwing to celebrate himself. Arthur's finger hovered over the seating chart, moving Kenji's name to the very center of the spotlight where the fall would be the most public. He coordinated with federal agents in hushed phone calls, ensuring that every legal T was crossed and every I was dotted. There was a rhythmic, almost meditative quality to his movements. He visited a private tailor in a hidden atelier, standing still as a master craftsman measured him for a tuxedo made of midnight blue silk. As the tailor adjusted the lapels, Arthur looked at his reflection. The hunched shoulders were gone. The tired, subservient mask of the janitor had dissolved, revealing the face of the man who had built an empire from a garage in Queens. In the final days before the gala, the trap was fully set. Kenji was shown on the news, bragging about the record-breaking night he had planned, oblivious to the fact that his bank accounts were being frozen one by one in the dark. Arthur took a final trip to the cemetery to sit by Martha's grave. The wind was cold, whisking away the dry leaves, but Arthur felt a strange warmth. "It's almost over, Martha," he whispered into the silence. "I'm going to bring the light back into the house we built." He left a single white rose on the headstone and walked back to his waiting car, his eyes cold and fixed on the horizon. The celebration was coming, but it wouldn't be the one Kenji Sato expected. The board was set, the pieces were in place, and the man the world saw as trash was about to sweep the room clean one last time. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was a sea of shimmering silk, polished tuxedos, and the heavy, cloying scent of status. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the gilded ceiling like frozen rain, casting a brilliant, unforgiving light over the city's elite. It was the night of the Aethelgard Legacy Gala, an event Kenji Sato had designed to be his ultimate coronation. He moved through the crowd like a king, a flute of vintage champagne in one hand and a practiced, predatory smile on his face. He checked his reflection in a mirrored pillar, adjusting his diamond cufflinks and smoothing the lapel of his $5,000 suit. To Kenji, the room wasn't filled with people, it was filled with witnesses to his greatness. Every laugh he elicited and every hand he shook felt like a brick in the monument he was building to himself. Near the entrance, Sarah stood clutching a small clutch bag, looking entirely out of place in a simple but elegant black dress. She had been invited by an anonymous benefactor, told only that her presence was required for a matter of corporate justice. She looked around the room with wide, nervous eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs. The opulence felt suffocating, a sharp contrast to the cramped apartment and the stack of unpaid bills she had been staring at only a week ago. As she tried to navigate toward the buffet, she accidentally brushed against Kenji's shoulder. He spun around, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury the moment he recognized her. Are you kidding me? Kenji's voice cut through the soft jazz of the live orchestra, sharp and jagged. He didn't care who heard him, in fact, he wanted them to hear. He snapped his fingers at a passing security guard, his eyes never leaving Sarah's trembling form. How did this person get past the velvet rope? I fired you for a reason, Sarah. This isn't a soup kitchen. It's a gala for the architects of the world, not the people who answer their phones. I was invited, Mr. Sato, Sarah stammered, her face flushing a deep, humiliated red as heads began to turn. I have a ticket. Kenji snatched the invitation from her hand, crumpled it into a ball, and dropped it into a half-empty glass of wine. I don't care if you have a golden ticket from God himself. You don't belong here. You smell like the service elevator. He turned to the growing crowd, throwing his arms out wide. Can you believe the nerve? First the janitor thinks he can talk to me, and now the help thinks they can drink our champagne. This is what happens when you let the wrong people think they're important. He leaned in closer to Sarah, his voice a low, venomous growl. Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing. And take your pathetic dignity with you. As the security guards moved in to grab Sarah's arms, Kenji stepped toward the center stage, signaled by a flourish from the orchestra. The room went dark, save for a single, powerful spotlight that followed him. He climbed the stairs to the podium, basking in the applause of the board members and investors. Ladies and gentlemen, Kenji began, his voice amplified by the massive sound system. Tonight is about legacy. It's about the strength to remove the weak and the vision to see the future. He chuckled, pointing a finger toward the back of the room. We recently had to do some house cleaning at Ethelgard. We had a janitor, an old man who thought his years of service gave him the right to look me in the eye. I had to show him the door, just like I'm showing this young lady the door tonight. Because at Ethelgard, we don't settle for mediocrity. We don't settle for trash. A large projector screen lowered behind him, and Kenji signaled for the tech booth to play his Vision of the Future presentation. He expected to see graphs of rising profits and his own face in various heroic poses. Instead, the screen flickered to life with a grainy, high-definition video feed of a dark hallway. The room went silent. It was a recording from the executive wing. The audio was crystal clear. It was Kenji's voice, frantic and shrill, discussing the $12 million embezzlement from the employee pension fund to cover his private gambling debts. The color began to drain from Kenji's face, a sickly gray hue creeping up his neck. He turned around, waving his arms frantically at the tech booth. Turn it off. That's a deepfake. Shut it down now, he screamed, his voice cracking. But the video didn't stop. It transitioned into a montage of his microaggressions, the moment he kicked the mop bucket, the moment he mocked Sarah, and the moment he called his own scholarship donors useful idiots. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted instantly. The air became heavy with a collective, icy shock. The board members leaned forward, their expressions turning from amusement to horror. Just as the video reached its climax, a shot of Kenji signing a fraudulent transfer document, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A man stepped into the light, moving with a grace and authority that commanded the attention of every soul in the room. He was wearing a tuxedo of midnight blue silk that fit him with surgical precision. His back was straight, his chin was high, and his eyes were like chips of blue ice. As he walked down the center aisle, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was the janitor. But it wasn't the man she had shared a muffin with in the basement. This man looked like he owned the city. He walked directly to the stage, never taking his eyes off the trembling, sweating man behind the podium. The silence was so absolute you could hear the soft click of his polished shoes on the carpet. Kenji backed away from the microphone, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the wood to stay upright. Arthur Penhaligon reached the stairs, his presence expanding until he seemed to fill the entire cavernous room. Arthur Penhaligon stepped onto the stage, the heavy silence of the ballroom magnifying the sound of his footsteps like a drumbeat. He moved with a terrifyingly calm precision, standing just inches away from Kenji Sato. The younger man looked like a cornered animal. His jaw was literally hanging open, and a bead of cold sweat rolled down his temple, dripping onto the lapel of his blazer. Kenji tried to speak, but all that came out was a dry, pathetic wheeze. He looked at Arthur's face, really looked at it for the first time, and saw not the invisible servant he had spent months mocking, but the architect of his own destruction. You stole that suit, Kenji finally stammered, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom with a desperate, high-pitched fragility. Security. Why is this janitor still standing here? Get him off my stage. He's a fraud. He's a nobody. Kenji swung his arms wildly, looking toward the security guards who were now standing frozen at the edges of the room, their eyes fixed on Arthur with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply held out his hand, and Marcus Thorne stepped onto the stage, placing a leather-bound folder into Arthur's grip. Arthur opened it slowly, the crisp sound of the parchment amplified by the microphone. "My name is Arthur Penhaligon," he said, and the resonance of his voice seemed to shake the very foundations of the Waldorf Astoria. "I am the founder of Ethelgard Global. I am the man who built this firm while you were still in diapers, Kenji. And I am the man who personally signed your scholarship check because I thought you had potential. I thought you had a soul." The room collectively exhaled, a sound like a rushing wind. Sarah, standing near the front, felt her knees go weak as the truth finally clicked into place. The billionaire owner had been the man sharing her blueberry muffin. Kenji's face didn't just turn pale, it turned a bruised, sickly gray. He looked at the investors, then back at Arthur, his mouth working silently like a fish out of water. "No," Kenji whispered, the word barely audible. "No, you're the janitor. I saw you. You were on your knees. I made you scrub the floor." "You did," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a level that felt like a gavel striking a bench. "I wanted to see what kind of man I had left my company to. I wanted to see if you remembered the weight of the dirt or if you had become blinded by the gold. You failed, Kenji. You didn't just fail me. You failed every single hardworking person in this building. You called them human debris. You called them trash. But the only trash in this room is the man who thinks a title gives him the right to be a monster." Arthur turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping over the frozen board members. "While I was cleaning your offices, I was also cleaning your books. I found the $12 million you moved to the Caymans, Kenji. I found the kickbacks from the construction firms. And I found the evidence of the systematic harassment you used to silence anyone who stood in your way." Arthur pointed a finger toward the back of the room, and the heavy double doors opened once more. This time, 6 agents in windbreakers with FBI and SEC stenciled across the back marched down the aisle. The panic in Kenji's eyes turned to sheer, unadulterated terror. He dropped to his knees, right there on the stage, in front of the cameras and the cream of New York society. He reached out, trying to grab the hem of Arthur's trousers. "Arthur, please. I was stressed. I wasn't thinking. I can pay it back. I'll do anything. Please, don't do this to me." He was sobbing now, the tears streaming down his face, ruining the image he had spent years crafting. It was a pathetic sight, the powerful CEO reduced to a begging child. Arthur looked down at him, and for a fleeting second, a flicker of that old mentorship returned, a shadow of the man who had once believed in Kenji. But then he looked at Sarah, who was still trembling from the humiliation Kenji had served her, and his heart turned back to stone. Arthur leaned down, his face just inches from Kenji's ear. "You told me that people like me were meant to be walked on," Arthur whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "But you forgot one thing about floors, Kenji. They are the only thing that actually supports you. And when the floor is gone, you have nowhere to go but down." Arthur stood up straight and looked at the federal agents. "Take him," he commanded. As the handcuffs clicked shut over Kenji's designer watch, the ballroom erupted into a deafening roar of applause. Arthur didn't smile. He simply watched as the man he had mentored was led away in shame, realizing that the house was finally clean. He walked over to the edge of the stage, reached down, and extended his hand to Sarah, pulling her up into the light where she belonged. The dust from the explosion at the Waldorf Astoria eventually settled, but the world Arthur Penhaligon returned to was forever changed. Within 48 hours, the board of directors had been purged of every member who had stood by while Kenji Sato turned the company into a playground for the cruel. Kenji himself didn't get a flashy exit. There were no more cameras or champagne flutes in the interrogation room, only the harsh hum of fluorescent lights and the weight of a 10-year sentence for grand larceny and embezzlement. He was stripped of his penthouses, his watches, and his pride, ending up in a state penitentiary where his designer name meant nothing and his status was lower than the dirt he once mocked. Arthur didn't spend his time gloating. Instead, he returned to the headquarters of Ethelgard Global, but he didn't enter through the service basement. He walked through the front doors, nodding to the security guards who now stood a little straighter, their faces bright with a newfound respect. He spent his first week as active chairman implementing the Martha Penhaligon Foundation, a massive internal initiative that turned every employee into a stakeholder. He ensured that the lowest paid worker in the building had a living wage, health insurance, and a voice that could reach the top floor without fear. One of his first acts was to call Sarah into his new office, the one Kenji had occupied. She walked in tentatively, still adjusting to the fact that her mortgage had been wiped clean and her daughter's college was paid for. Arthur didn't sit behind the massive mahogany desk. He sat in a simple chair across from her. "Sarah," he said, his voice warm and steady, "I need someone who understands that the most important part of this building isn't the glass, but the people inside it. I want you to head our new corporate culture and welfare department. You'll be the one making sure no one ever feels invisible here again." Through her tears of joy, Sarah realized that Arthur hadn't just saved her job, he had given her a purpose. 5 years passed in a blink. The corporate world often forgets its scandals, but Ethelgard Global became a legend for its heart. One rainy Tuesday morning, a young man in his early 20s walked through the lobby. He was wearing a faded, slightly oversized janitor's uniform, looking nervous as he gripped the handle of his mop bucket. He was a new hire, a kid from the Bronx trying to support his younger siblings. As he started to clean a smudge off the marble, he didn't see the elderly man in a sharp, understated suit walking toward him. The young man accidentally bumped into the older man's shoulder. The young janitor froze, his face turning pale. "I am so sorry, sir. I didn't see you. I'll get out of your way right now," he stammered, his voice thick with the fear of 1,000 Kenjis he had encountered in his life. He braced himself for a lecture or a firing. Instead, Arthur Penhaligon smiled, a genuine, soft expression that reached his eyes. He reached out and steadied the young man's mop bucket. "There's no need to apologize, son. You're doing a fine job. This floor is the foundation of everything we do here." Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a sealed white envelope. "I've been watching you work this morning. You have a good heart and a steady hand. Inside this envelope is a full scholarship to the University of New York. You keep working hard, and when you graduate, there's a desk waiting for you on the 50th floor." The young man stood there, speechless, his eyes welling with tears as Arthur walked away with a slight, satisfied hum. In the center of the lobby, where Kenji once mocked a man in overalls, there now stood a small, silver-plated mop on a pedestal. It wasn't a joke, it was a monument. It reminded every executive who walked past it that wealth is merely a temporary possession, but character is an eternal legacy. Arthur looked out the window at the New York skyline, feeling Martha's presence in the quiet dignity of the halls. He had learned long ago that the greatest truth in life is often the one we choose to ignore. That the clothes a man wears are just fabric, and the title he holds is just ink. True power doesn't demand respect through fear. It earns it through the simple, quiet act of seeing the humanity in everyone. Because in the end, we are all just guests in this house, and the only thing that truly matters is how clean we leave the world for those who come after us. Never judge a book by its cover, for the man cleaning the floor today might just be the one who owns the building tomorrow.